Larkspur Hollow went quiet. The kind of quiet that settles thick as dust after a stampede, and the old-timers swore they could feel it in their teeth. Sunlight hammered down on a road baked the color of old rust. A dog slept in a strip of shade. Somewhere, a chicken complained about nothing in particular. And the woman sat there. Hat low. Boots crossed at the ankle. A poncho gone gray, with trail dust, one shoulder seemed torn loose long ago, and never mended. She ordered a whiskey she had no coin to pay for. Spurs sounded from the far end of the street. The kind of noise that only comes off a man who's never once had to be afraid of anything. A shadow crossed her boots. She didn't look up. Because that was always how it started. Some fool mistaking calm for weakness. A bucket of ice water lifted high. The town of Larkspur Hollow had a way of going quiet before something terrible happened. Old-timers swore they could feel it in their teeth. A stillness that settled over the rooftops like dust after a stampede, thick and gray, and waiting for a reason to fall. That kind of quiet dropped over Larkspur Hollow on the afternoon a woman sat down outside the Silver Crown Saloon and ordered a whiskey she had no coin to pay for. Because that was how it always started. Some fool mistaking calm for weakness. Some fool about to learn different. The street stretched wide and dry in front of her, baked the color of old rust, heat rising off it in waves that made the far end of town shimmer like something not quite real. A dog slept in a strip of shade beneath the mercantile porch. Somewhere a chicken complained about nothing in particular. And Beatrix called her. Nobody in 3 states called her Beatrix anymore, not since she'd buried that name along with everything else that mattered, sat in a chair tipped back against the saloon wall, hat low over her eyes, boots crossed at the ankle, like she had nowhere on God's green earth left to be. She did. She had somewhere to be. She'd had somewhere to be for going on 8 years now. Except you couldn't outrun 8 years by hurrying. She'd learned that the hard way, across more towns than she cared to count anymore. So she sat. And she waited. And she let the whiskey burn a slow line down her throat, while flies traced lazy circles above the empty glass beside her. Her poncho had gone gray, with trail dust, the color leached clean out by sun, and rain, and time. One shoulder seam had torn loose somewhere around the Nebraska line, and never been mended. Because mending things required staying in one place long enough to thread a needle, and staying in one place was a luxury Trix hadn't allowed herself, since the night everything she loved had come apart in a single afternoon. She didn't think about that afternoon. Not on purpose. Except it never once asked her permission, before it came calling anyway. Which was fine. She'd gotten good at shoving it back down. Down where the whiskey couldn't touch it and the road couldn't shake it loose. Down where it just sat, patient, the way a rattlesnake sits patient in tall grass, waiting for a foot to fall wrong. A shadow crossed her boots. She didn't look up. Didn't need to. She'd heard the boots coming a full block off, the particular swagger of a man who'd never once had to be afraid of anything in his whole life, because men like that always announced themselves long before they arrived. Loud spurs. Louder mouth. The kind of confidence that only ever grew in a man who'd never once been humbled. Well. The voice belonged to somebody big, thick through the shoulders, a week's worth of stubble and a week's worth of whiskey both crusted onto his face in equal measure. Look what the wind dragged in. Trix said nothing. Heard about you. He leaned in, close enough she caught the sour mash on his breath. Heard you turned a whole bank red once. Heard the men who rode with you are all 6 feet under, and you're the last one left standing to hang for it. Still nothing. Her thumb moved, slow, along the rim of the empty glass. A small motion. A patient one. Heard you don't talk much. He grinned back at the men gathered behind him, 4 of them, spread loose across the street the way men do, when they think spreading out makes them harder to hit. Maybe you don't talk at all. Maybe the ghost don't have a voice. Because that was the name that had followed her the last 3 towns running. The ghost. Nobody knew for certain if it was a man or a woman under that hat and that dust. Nobody had lived long enough to ask a second time. He picked up the wooden bucket sitting by the trough. Lifted it high enough that she finally tilted her chin just enough to watch him do it. Let's see if a ghost bleeds. The water hit her like a slap made of ice, even in that heat, running down through her hair and into her collar, pooling dark in the dust at her boots. The men behind him laughed. Ugly laughter. The kind that came easy to men who'd never once had to earn their own courage. Trix wiped the water from her eyes. Slow. Deliberate. Like she had all the time this world had ever made, because in her experience, the men who believed they'd already won were always the ones who ran shortest on time. She picked the whiskey glass back up. Found it empty. Set it back down. You should have bought me another round, she said. First words out of her mouth in 3 days. The big man's grin faltered. Just a fraction. Just enough. Because something about her voice didn't match anything he'd expected. Not rough. Not broken. Something underneath it, low and even, that raised the hair along the back of his neck, though he couldn't have told you why, if his life depended on it. Which, as it turned out, it very nearly did. On your knees, he said instead, louder now, playing to the street, playing to the windows, where curtains twitched and eyes peered out from behind dusty glass. On your knees, ghost, or we do this the hard way. The wind picked up. Somewhere down the block a loose shutter banged twice against a wall and went still. The saloon sign overhead creaked on its chain, back and forth, the only sound left in a street gone dead silent, because every soul in Larkspur Hollow, with a window to hide behind, had already found one. Trix set both boots flat against the ground. Stood, slow. Water still dripping off her chin. You want to shoot me, she said. That's fine. Man's got to do something with his afternoon. She looked at the 5 of them, spread loose across the street, standing close enough together that a blind man missing one arm could have clipped 2 of them at once. But you might want to spread out first. Nobody moved. Which was the whole problem, with men who'd never once been shot at. They didn't know yet that words like that only ever came out of people who meant every one of them. Then the first shot cracked the afternoon clean in half. She never said who fired it. Didn't matter. What mattered was what came after, and after happened, so fast that half the men on that street would spend the rest of their natural lives arguing about the order of it, and never once agree. The big man went down first, flat on his back, before the last of the water had even finished dripping off his own boots. The second man, the one on the right, already fumbling his shotgun up too slow, always too slow, took a round, through the shoulder, that spun him hard, into a support post, and folded him over it like a broken doll left out in the rain. Glass shattered somewhere behind her. A horse screamed, and reared against its tether, striking sparks off the hitching rail. And Trix moved, through all of it low, and fast, using the water trough for cover, using the porch post, using every splinter of wood and grain of dust that Larkspur Hollow had left to offer, because she'd learned a long time ago that standing still got you killed, and running blind got you killed, and the only thing that ever kept a body breathing was moving, with purpose even when purpose felt like the very last thing left in the world. Nobody could say afterward who fired the 3rd shot. Or the 4th. Or the 5th. All they knew, all any soul on that street could agree on years later, telling the story to grandchildren over supper, was that a woman soaked clean, through and dripping saloon water, into the dust had walked, through gunfire like she'd been born inside it. Like the whole West itself had raised her on nothing else. And when the smoke cleared, actual smoke now, drifting thin and gray across a street gone suddenly, terribly quiet, 5 men lay scattered, through the dust of Larkspur Hollow, and one woman stood in the middle of them, blood running warm down her own left arm, a revolver still smoking loose in her hand. A young boy, couldn't have been more than 9 or 10, peered out from behind an overturned apple crate at the edge of the street, eyes wide as saucers, too scared to run, and too fascinated to look away. Trix didn't smile at him. Didn't scowl either. Just held his gaze a moment, the way you'd hold the gaze of any wild thing you didn't want to spook, and bent down slow to retrieve her hat, where it had tumbled loose, into the dust. Except it wasn't only the hat that had come loose. Because somewhere in all that motion, all that gunpowder, and men going down hard, the wide brim had slipped free, and taken her braid down with it, and now that braid fell dark and heavy past her shoulders, catching the afternoon light in a way that undid, in a single silent second, everything the street believed it already knew. A woman. The word rippled backward, through Larkspur Hollow like a stone dropped into still water. Curtains that had barely dared to twitch now flew wide open. A man on the mercantile's second floor leaned, so far out his own window he nearly tumbled through it. Somewhere behind the saloon, a woman's voice gasped out loud, sharp enough to carry 2 full blocks. The ghost of the Western Territories. The gunslinger who'd left a trail of empty towns and full graveyards clear, from the Dakota line down, through 3 other states. Was a woman. Trix set the hat back on her head. Didn't look at any of them. Didn't need to. She could feel every eye on that street crawling over her the way ants crawl over something already down, and she'd felt that particular kind of stare often enough by now to know exactly what it meant. It meant the story had just gotten a great deal more interesting to a great many people, who preferred a good story to an inconvenient truth. She bent to check the pulse of the man who'd thrown the water. Alive. Barely, but alive, breathing shallow through a wound that would keep him laid up a full month, but wouldn't put him in the ground. She'd aimed for that. Always aimed for that, when the choice was hers to make. It was a rule older than the gun itself, carried with her, from a life, so far back it sometimes felt like it had happened to somebody else. Never point a weapon at someone weaker than you, unless there's no other road left to walk. These men had chosen their own road. But she still hadn't wanted to end it for good. Not when a shoulder wound could teach a man the same lesson a grave would, and teach it to somebody who might yet live long enough to actually learn something. She was still crouched there, 2 fingers pressed against a stranger's throat, when an old man's voice cracked out across the street, from the doorway of the barber shop. That's her. Every head on that street turned at once. He stood framed in the doorway, straight razor still clutched forgotten in one trembling hand, face gone the color of ash beneath a lifetime of sun. He took a step forward. Then another. His whole body shaking like a man walking toward a ghost he'd spent 8 years on his knees praying he'd never lay eyes on again. I remember her. His voice cracked, broke apart, came back together jagged at the edges. The bank. 8 years back. I was there. Because of course he'd been there. Because near enough every soul, over the age of 20 in Larkspur Hollow had been there, one way or another, on the day the first trust bank turned into a slaughterhouse, and half the town's fathers and sons went into the ground before sundown. It was the kind of day a town didn't forget. Couldn't forget, no matter how badly forgetting might have suited it. Trix went very still. Didn't stand. Didn't reach for her gun either, though every man still conscious on that street had a hand hovering somewhere close to a holster. Elias. The name slipped out of her before she'd meant to let it. Low. Almost gentle, in a voice that matched nothing else about that particular afternoon. The old man, Elias Crane, barber of Larkspur Hollow going on 30 years, a man who'd trimmed the hair of half the county and buried the other half, stopped a dozen feet off and simply stared at her like she was something that shouldn't exist. Something crawled up out of a grave that was supposed to have stayed sealed. You pulled me out. His hand shook so badly the razor nearly slipped free of it. That day. I was down. There was a horse coming, and I couldn't get up and you. He stopped. Couldn't finish it. Didn't need to. Because the whole street was remembering now, whether it wanted to or not, and the remembering came in pieces, sharp and jagged, the way memory always came back, when it had been buried too long and too deep to come up whole. The bank robbery. The gang that had ridden into Larkspur Hollow like a hurricane made of bullets and greed. The back door that had somehow, impossibly, been left unlocked, though every soul in town swore up and down that door had never once been left unlocked, not ever, not before that day, and not since. 3 robbers dead in the street, before the smoke ever cleared. A 4th captured and hanged inside the month. And a 5th, a woman, though nobody had ever managed to prove that part, only whispered it, who had vanished into the hills before the dust settled, leaving behind a town full of widows, and a legend that had only grown larger with every passing year. That legend was standing in the middle of the street right now. Soaked to the bone. Bleeding from the shoulder. And somehow, impossibly, she was the very same woman who'd once dragged an old barber clear of a panicked horse's hooves on the worst day Larkspur Hollow had ever managed to survive. She's the one. Elias's voice climbed now, cracking with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite grief, but sat somewhere painful in between the two. She's the one who robbed us. She's the reason, my boy. He stopped again. This time the silence that followed carried weight. Carried shape. Because everybody on that street knew what came after that sentence, and nobody needed him to finish saying it out loud. Trix rose, finally, slow, wounded arm hanging loose at her side. I didn't rob that bank, she said. Nobody believed her. She could see it in every face turned her way, could feel the disbelief settling over the street like fog rolling down off the hills. 8 years of a story told, and retold until it had calcified into something harder than truth itself, something that no longer bent for facts, because it had stopped needing facts a long time ago. It was about grief now. About having somewhere to point all that grief. Some name to hang it on. Some face to hate. Her face had been that name for going on a decade now, whether she'd rightly earned it or not. Because that was the trouble with towns just like this one. They didn't much need the truth. They needed somebody to blame, and once they'd found that somebody, the truth turned into a stranger nobody much cared to let back inside. The old man was still staring at her, torn clean in half between 2 memories refusing to sit together in the same body. The woman who saved him. The woman the whole territory called a murderer. He opened his mouth like he might say something that could bridge that gap, but before a single word escaped him, another sound cut through the street. Boots. Fast and heavy, coming on from the direction of the sheriff's office at the far end of town. Every head turned again, because the sound of those boots carried something altogether different than the panic that had come before it. It carried purpose. Cold and deliberate, the kind of purpose that made a grown man's stomach drop before he'd even worked out why. The sheriff's office door had burst open. Sheriff Wendell Ashby stepped out into the afternoon sun, with a Winchester rifle held loose, but ready across his body, and behind him came 6 more men, spilling out onto the boardwalk, with rifles and shotguns already half raised, spreading along both sides of the street, with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested this wasn't the first time they'd rehearsed this particular dance. He was a tall man, Ashby. Broad through the shoulders in a way that still filled out a tailored coat, silver star pinned crooked on his chest, a face that had learned a long time ago how to arrange itself into whatever expression a moment required. Right now at war concern. Righteous, town-protecting concern. Trix had seen that kind of face plenty of times before. On men who'd learned to wear honesty like a costume, because somewhere along the way they'd figured out the costume worked better than the real article ever had. Something about him raised the hair along the back of her neck. She couldn't have said exactly what. Not yet. Just a feeling, low and cold, the same kind of feeling that had kept her alive 8 years running, when nothing else would have managed it. Well now. Ashby's voice carried easy across the street, pitched loud enough for every window and every hiding townsperson to catch. Look what walked back into my town. He didn't so much as glance at the 5 men bleeding out in the dust. Didn't spare them a single look, which struck Trix as strange for a lawman standing in the middle of what should have appeared, to any reasonable eye, like a street full of victims. Except Ashby wasn't looking at victims. He was looking at an opportunity. Folks. He raised his voice further, turning to address the crowd creeping cautiously back out, from behind curtains and storefronts, drawn by that particular human hunger to witness something terrible just so long as it was happening to somebody else. You all know who this is. A murmur ran through the gathering crowd. Ugly. Quick. The way fear always moved faster than fact. This is the woman who helped burn down the First Trust Bank 8 years past. Ashby let that sentence sit a moment, let it settle over the crowd like a weight dropped from a height. This is the reason half of you buried a husband, a brother, a son. And she's had the nerve, the gall, to ride back into Larkspur Hollow like she's got nothing whatsoever to answer for. That's not, Trix started. Quiet. He didn't even look at her when he said it. Just raised one hand, casual, the way you'd swat off a fly, and the sheer confidence of the gesture landed harder than a shout ever could have. You'll get your chance to talk. At the end of a rope, most likely. But you'll get your chance. The crowd's murmur sharpened into something with teeth in it. Trix stood very still. Blood running slow and steady from her shoulder, water still dripping from her hair, 5 wounded men scattered around her in the dust, and every hard-won instinct screaming at once that this moment, right here, right now, was the hinge the whole afternoon turned on. The place where everything might yet tip one way or the other, and there wasn't a single word left in her that could tip it back toward her. Because a story like the one Ashby was spinning didn't need to be true. It only needed to be simple. And simple stories always beat complicated ones in front of a crowd already frightened and hunting for someone to hate. $2,000. Ashby said it plain, and the number landed on that crowd like a struck match on dry grass. $2,000 to any man who brings her in. Alive, if you can manage it. I'd take real pleasure watching her hang proper, in front of every soul she's wronged. Somewhere in the crowd, somebody actually gasped at the figure. $2,000 was more than most men in Larkspur Hollow would see in 5 honest years of labor. It was the kind of number that made hungry men do things they'd never otherwise consider. Made desperate men brave. Made careful men reckless. Trix watched it happen in real time. Watched the fear on those faces curdle slowly into something greedier, something calculating, as men who'd been hiding behind their own front doors 10 minutes prior began, one by one, reaching for rifles kept behind those same doors. She had exactly one window left open to her. She could feel it closing. Elias. She said the old man's name again, quiet, urgent, the last card left in her hand. You know what really happened that day. You were there. The old barber's face twisted, caught between 2 truths, refusing to make any peace with one another. He opened his mouth. Don't listen to her, Ashby cut in smooth, before a single word could escape. She's been running 8 years, because she knows exactly what she did. Innocent people don't run, Elias. Innocent people stay put and answer for themselves. Except that wasn't true, not by half, and some small, buried part of Trix wanted badly to scream it out loud that she'd run, because the only alternative to running had been a noose around her neck, before a single honest question ever got asked, that she'd run, with a baby not 3 weeks in the world wrapped tight against her chest, because staying meant that child grew up an orphan in a town already decided her mother was a monster. But you couldn't scream truth into a crowd already drunk on the taste of a $2,000 reward. A rifle shot cracked the air, close enough the round kicked dirt inches from her boot. That was the sound that broke the dam. Chaos didn't arrive slow. It arrived all at once, the way a dam never cracks a little at a time. It holds, and holds, and holds, and then it simply isn't holding anymore, and everything behind it comes through together. Horses screamed and reared against their hitching posts. Somebody's shotgun went off wild, taking out a second-story window in an explosion of glass raining down onto the boardwalk below. A wagon driver abandoned his load in the middle of the street and dove behind a rain barrel. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Trix was moving, low and fast, the same instincts that had carried her clean through 5 armed men not 10 minutes before, now carrying her toward the narrow gap between the saloon and the mercantile, the only cover the street had left to give. A bullet splintered the wood beside her head. She didn't flinch. Couldn't afford to. Flinching cost half a second, and half a second was the entire difference between walking away and not walking away, a lesson 8 years had carved so deep into her bones it no longer even felt like thought. It felt like breathing. Because that was what running did to a person, in the end. It didn't only change what you did. It changed what your body did, before your mind ever caught up to the decision at all. She rounded the mercantile's corner, into the alley beyond, and kept moving, boots pounding dust, shoulders screaming with every stride, the street's chaos fading behind her, into something distant and unreal, like a nightmare she was only now waking from. Except she wasn't waking. She was still very much inside it. Behind her, Ashby's voice still carried over the noise, directing his men, and something about the calm precision of that voice even in the thick of chaos snagged at her thoughts and refused to let go. A man genuinely chasing justice sounded scared, at least once in a while. Sounded uncertain. Ashby didn't sound uncertain. He sounded like a man conducting an orchestra he'd rehearsed 100 times over. She filed that thought away the way she filed away everything dangerous and unresolved, deep and quiet, for later, because right now the only thing that mattered was putting distance between herself and a town willing to pay $2,000 for the privilege of watching her die. She ran until the buildings thinned behind her. Until the street noise faded to nothing but wind and her own ragged breath. Until the last structure at the edge of Larkspur Hollow, an old barn, roof sagging, paint long since stripped bare by weather and time, rose up out of a field of dead, sun-scorched wheat like the only shelter left standing in the whole world. She didn't think. Didn't plan. Just shouldered through the half-rotted door and collapsed against the inside wall, chest heaving, blood soaking dark through her sleeve, and let herself, for one single unguarded moment, feel exactly how tired she'd become. Not 1 year of this. Not 2. Nearly a decade. A decade of towns just like this one. A decade of running ahead of the story before it could catch her, except the story always did catch up eventually, because a legend that size never stayed quiet no matter how far or how fast a body rode from it. She closed her eyes. Only a second. Only long enough to remember, because the memory never truly left, it only waited, patient as that snake in tall grass, the sound of a bank alarm ringing wrong. The sound of gunfire that shouldn't have come, that fast, that organized, like somebody had known exactly when to expect it. The sound of Daniel's voice, low and urgent, telling her to run, just run, get out, get the baby out. She opened her eyes. Enough. Not now. Maybe never, but certainly not now. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the barn's loose boards, and her horse, tied near the door, ribs still heaving from the run, stamped nervous against the packed dirt floor. Trix pressed a hand to her shoulder wound, felt the warm slide of blood between her fingers, and let herself slide down the wall, until she sat, back against rotting wood, revolver loose in her other hand. She didn't know how long she sat there. Long enough that the light leaking through the barn's cracked walls shifted from harsh afternoon gold to something softer, redder, the color of a day finally admitting it had ended. Long enough that, when the door creaked open again, slow and careful, she had the revolver up and aimed before her mind had even finished the thought. The figure in the doorway froze. An older woman. Gray streaked through dark hair pulled back tight, a black dress worn soft, with age and use, a medicine bag clutched in one hand and, tucked beneath the other arm, a small bottle catching the last light in a warm amber glint. "I mean you no harm." The woman's voice came out steady despite the gun leveled at her chest, and that alone told Trix something worth knowing, because most folks, even brave ones, couldn't manage steady, with a barrel pointed at their heart. "I heard what happened in town. Figured somebody ought to look at that shoulder before it turns bad on you." Trix didn't lower the gun. Not yet. A decade of caution didn't dissolve simply, because a stranger's voice happened to sound kind. "Who are you?" "Agnes." The woman stepped forward, slow, hands visible, medicine bag held out slightly, like an offering laid down between them. "Agnes Whitfield. I live at the edge of town, past the old mill road." The name meant nothing to Trix. Should have meant nothing at all. Except something in the woman's face, something careful, something watching, something that looked at Trix not the way the rest of Larkspur Hollow had looked at her, that afternoon, not with fear, or hunger, but with an odd, aching kind of recognition, made her lower the revolver, just slightly. "Just enough. I can understand why people are afraid of you," Agnes said quietly, setting the medicine bag down on a stack of old crates. "Whole town's talking of nothing else. What you did in that street. The sheriff's reward. I didn't come back to rob anybody." Trix's voice came out rougher than she'd meant it, exhaustion and blood loss dragging hard at every edge of it. "Didn't even mean to come back at all, if I'm honest." Agnes's hand stilled over the medicine bag. "Then why did you?" Trix didn't answer straight off. Because the honest answer, that she'd been circling closer to Larkspur Hollow for the better part of a year, without ever letting herself say why, that some buried, stubborn corner of her had needed to see the town one final time even knowing exactly what waited there, felt too raw to hand over to a stranger, even a kind one. "Needed supplies," she said instead. Which was true. Just not the whole of it. Agnes crossed the barn slow, and knelt beside her, reaching for the torn sleeve, with careful, practiced hands. A doctor's hands, or close enough to one, the kind of hands that had tended wounds before and knew exactly how much pressure a body could take, before flinching turned into something worse. "This is going to hurt," Agnes warned, and it did, cleaning the wound, with something that burned like fire, and Trix bit down hard enough on the inside of her cheek to taste copper rather than let a single sound escape. Because that was another rule she'd learned somewhere along the long road between who she used to be and who she'd been forced to become. Never let them hear you break. Not even here. Not even now, with just the two of them and a half-collapsed barn and a wound that hurt worse than anything rightly ought to. Agnes worked in silence a while, wrapping the shoulder tight with clean cloth, and the quiet stretched between them, comfortable in a way Trix hadn't expected, until the older woman finally spoke again, voice dropped low. "You don't remember me," Agnes said. It wasn't a question. Trix studied her face properly for the first time. Studied the lines around her eyes, the particular gray threading her hair, the way she carried her shoulders like a woman who'd hauled something heavy for a long, long while and never once set it down. Something flickered at the edge of memory. Distant. Unformed. Should I? Agnes's eyes filled, sudden and unbidden, and she looked away a moment, out through the gap in the barn wall toward the darkening fields beyond. "Years back," she said finally, "there was a woman standing in the middle of the street outside the First Trust Bank. Holding her baby, so tight the child could hardly draw breath. Gunfire coming from every side, and I was standing not 10 feet off, with my own boy clinging to my skirts, certain sure we were both about to die." Trix's chest went tight. The memory she'd spent a decade pushing under rose now, with a force she couldn't hold back, sharp-edged and immediate, gunpowder in her nose, her own heartbeat roaring in her ears, Daniel's hand shoving her hard toward the alley, the desperate animal need to get her newborn daughter somewhere, anywhere, safe. "You pulled us both clear," Agnes said, voice cracking now. Pushed us behind that overturned wagon. Took a bullet meant for my boy's back, and never once slowed to check if you were hurt yourself. Trix stared at her. Something in her chest cracked open, slow and painful, the way a door creaks after being shut too long. I don't remember your face, she said, quiet. I remember hands. I remember a boy crying. I don't let myself remember faces from that day. I understand that. Agnes reached out and covered Trix's hand with her own, weathered fingers wrapping scarred knuckles. I've spent all this time trying to forget it too. Except some things don't allow themselves to be forgotten. They only wait. The barn creaked around them, wind pressing at old walls, and somewhere out past it a night bird called low into the gathering dark. I owe you a debt I've never once had the chance to repay, Agnes said. And I believe it's long past time I did. Trix opened her mouth to say it wasn't needed, that she hadn't ridden back into Larkspur Hollow looking for gratitude, that gratitude from a stranger in a burned-out barn wasn't going to undo a decade of running, or a town's worth of hatred waiting just past the tree line. But something in the older woman's face stopped the words before they'd properly formed. Something urgent. Something that looked, all of a sudden, like fear standing right alongside the gratitude. There's something you need to know, Agnes said. Something I ought to have found you and told a long time back, except I never knew how, and then too much time slipped past, and the longer I waited the harder it grew to imagine ever saying it at all. Trix's whole body went still. Something cold moved through her, some instinct older than thought, the same instinct that had put a revolver in her hand, before her mind ever caught up to the door opening. Say it, she said. Agnes's hand tightened around hers. Right after the robbery. Right after Daniel. The name landed between them like a stone dropped into still water, and Trix flinched at the sound of it, a name she hadn't let a living soul speak aloud in longer than she could rightly remember. You handed your daughter to a woman at the edge of town. Told her to get the baby somewhere safe. Somewhere far. Somewhere the Calder name would never once follow her. I remember, Trix said, voice gone thin, stretched tight over something that felt like it might shatter if pushed too hard. I never heard from her again. Always believed she stopped. Swallowed. Always believed she took my daughter east. Somewhere far. Somewhere safe. Agnes was crying now, openly, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on her face. That woman was me, she said. And I never took her anywhere at all. The barn seemed to hold its own breath around them. Even the wind outside seemed to still, or maybe every other sound in the world had simply stopped mattering next to the weight of that single sentence. What are you saying? Trix's voice had dropped near to nothing. Agnes. What are you saying to me? I couldn't do it. The words tumbled out of Agnes in a rush now, all that held back confession finally breaking loose at once. Got as far as the county line and couldn't make myself hand that baby over to strangers, not after what you'd done for my own boy, not after watching you take a bullet to save a child that wasn't even yours to save. So I brought her back. Raised her myself. Quiet. Careful. Told anyone who asked she was a niece come to live with me after her folks had passed. Trix's hand had begun to shake, tremor climbing from her fingers up, through her whole arm, and she barely felt it. Every other sensation in her body narrowed down to the sound of Agnes's voice, and the impossible, unbearable weight of what it was telling her. She's alive, Agnes said. She's here. Been here the whole while, not 2 miles, from where you're sitting right now, and she's got your eyes, and she asks me sometimes, quiet, the way a child asks something she already half knows not to ask too loud, whether her mother's ever coming back for her. Trix couldn't breathe. Couldn't speak. Years of grief, years of believing she'd handed her daughter into some kinder future far off from a name that had come to mean nothing but danger, years of carrying that particular grief like a stone sewn into her chest, all of it cracked open at once, and what came rushing in behind it wasn't relief. Not yet. Not fully. Something rawer than relief. Something closer to disbelief. Something that hurt worse than the bullet wound in her shoulder by a distance too wide to properly measure. Her name, Trix managed at last, words scraping raw out of her throat. What did you name her? Agnes's face softened, just slightly, through the tears. Nell, she said. I named her Nell. Outside, full dark had settled, over the fields beyond Larkspur Hollow, and somewhere far off, faint enough it might only have been imagining, a dog began barking at something moving in the night. Trix sat very still in the ruin of that old barn, blood dried stiff on her shoulder, a stranger's hand still wrapped tight around her own, and let a single, silent tear finally cut its own path down, through years of dust. She had a daughter. Alive. Close enough to reach. And somewhere behind her, back in the heart of a town, that had just placed a $2,000 price on her head, that same daughter was sleeping tonight, with no notion at all of, who had just ridden back, into Larkspur Hollow looking for her. I want to see her. The words left Trix, before she'd finished deciding to say them. Tonight. Right now. Agnes's hand tightened around hers. Not letting go. Not yet. You can't. Watch me. Beatrix. The old name, full and formal, landed harder than a slap. Agnes hadn't used it once, since walking into that barn, had called her nothing at all, careful the way a person is careful around something wounded. Using it now was deliberate. A rope thrown to haul her back, from the edge. There are men, with rifles combing every street in that town right now, hunting a reason to collect $2,000. You walk in tonight, you don't find your daughter. You find a rope. Trix's jaw worked. Because she knew that. Knew it the way she knew the weight of her own gun, the way she knew the sound of hoofbeats behind her in the dark. Knowledge like that didn't argue with a person. It just sat there. Correct. Unbearable. Then what? Her voice cracked on the second word, and she hated that it cracked, hated that years of keeping her voice level in front of armed men had finally split wide open in front of one old woman inside a burned-out barn. What do I do, Agnes? Sit here. Bleed. Wait. Yes. Agnes said it simple. No apology folded into it. That's exactly what you do. Trix closed her eyes. Behind her lids she could already see it, a small girl, with dark hair, a girl she'd never actually laid eyes on, a girl her mind was busy inventing a face for out of nothing, but hope and a decade of imagining. Which was its own particular cruelty. Because now that the door stood open, she couldn't shut it again. Couldn't unknow what she now knew. Tell me about her, Trix said instead, because if she couldn't hold her daughter tonight, she could at least hold the idea of her a little longer. Tell me something. Anything at all. Agnes's face softened in the low lamplight. She's stubborn, she said. Won't eat her greens no matter how I hide them under the potatoes. Talks to the chickens like they follow every word she says. Cried a solid week when her favorite hen quit laying, like the world itself had ended. A small, watery laugh escaped her. Got a scar on her chin, from tumbling off the porch rail last spring. Insists on wearing her boots clean, through summer, says shoes without spurs aren't real boots at all. Trix felt something break loose in her chest, warm and painful at once. She sounds like her father, she whispered. Agnes went quiet at that. A different sort of quiet. The kind with something heavy folded up inside it. What? Trix said, reading it instantly, because a decade on the run had taught her to read silence the way other folks read a newspaper. Agnes. What? Nothing. Too fast. Too smooth. It's late. You need rest, and that shoulder needs to stay still, and there's nothing more tonight that talking's going to mend. Trix studied her a long moment. Filed it away. Because something sat there, something Agnes wasn't saying, but pushing on it now, with blood still drying on her sleeve, and her daughter's name still ringing new in her ears, felt like more weight than either of them could carry at once. So she let it lie. For now. She didn't sleep. Not properly. Lay against the barn wall, with her revolver loose in one hand, and her eyes half shut, drifting in and out of something that wasn't quite rest, listening to every creak of old wood, and every gust of wind that rattled the loose boards overhead. Because that was the other thing running had taught her. Sleep was a debt paid for later. Vigilance was the only currency that ever kept a body breathing. Agnes had gone still in the corner, wrapped in an old horse blanket, breathing slow and even. Trix envied her that. Envied anybody who could still sleep sound after a day such as the one they'd just survived. Sometime past midnight, her horse's ears pricked forward. Trix was on her feet before she'd fully registered why. Some animal instinct in her own body answering the animal instinct in the horse's, both of them tuned to the same frequency of danger long before conscious thought caught up. She crossed to the gap in the barn wall. Pressed her eye to it. Torches. 3, maybe 4, bobbing in a loose line across the dark field beyond, moving slow but moving with purpose. Voices carried faint on the night wind, too distant for words, but the tone was unmistakable. Men hunting. Agnes. Trix's voice came low, urgent. Wake up. Now. The old woman startled upright, blinking against the dark. What? They've found us. Because of course they had. Because $2,000 was the kind of number that turned tired men sleepless, turned careful men careless, turned an entire town into a search party working straight through the night on nothing but greed and torchlight. She should have expected it sooner. Should have moved them somewhere deeper than the first abandoned barn on the edge of town. Except there hadn't been time. There was never quite enough time. That was the whole shape of her life these past years, always one step behind the moment she needed to have already acted in. Back door, Agnes whispered, already moving, gathering her medicine bag, with hands shaking only slightly. Gap in the fence past the old grain chute. Leads out toward the creek. You know this barn. Grew up 2 farms over. A grim, tight smile. Used to hide out here myself, as a girl. Different reasons entirely. They moved fast, through the dark interior, feeling their way past broken stalls and rotted feed troughs, Trix's shoulder screaming with every jolt of motion, but her body refusing to slow, because slowing wasn't a luxury the night was offering. Behind them, faint but growing, boots in dry grass. A dog barking, sharp and excited, catching a scent. Faster, Trix breathed. They'd nearly reached the back wall, when the first torch found the very gap they'd been aiming for. A shout went up outside. Here! I see movement. Trix shoved Agnes ahead of her toward the fence gap, spun back with the revolver raised, and fired once, into the dark, not aimed to kill, aimed to scatter, aimed to buy exactly the handful of seconds 2 frightened women needed to vanish, into the black beyond the barn's own shadow. It worked. For about 4 seconds. Then the first torch caught the dry hay stacked along the barn's near wall, and the whole structure went up like it had been waiting all night for precisely that kind of permission. Fire moved faster than Trix ever remembered fire moving. 1 second the barn wall was only old wood and shadow, and the next it was a wall of orange climbing hungry toward the roof, throwing light out across the field bright enough to turn night into some strange, flickering counterfeit of day. Go, Trix shouted, shoving Agnes through the fence gap ahead of her. Go, go. Behind them the barn's roof gave a groan like something dying, a section of it collapsing inward, with a crash that sent sparks spiraling up into the black sky. The horse, Trix's horse, still tied near the front, screamed in the kind of pure animal terror no amount of training ever fully erases, and Trix's stomach dropped, because she couldn't leave it. Wouldn't leave it. Not after everything that animal had carried her through. Trix, Agnes grabbed for her arm. There's no time. There's always time for one more thing. The words came out grim, half joke and half prayer, and Trix was already moving back toward the burning structure before she'd finished saying them. Because that was the truth about her, the thing years of running had never once managed to burn clean out of her no matter how hard the world tried. She didn't leave things behind. Not horses. Not strangers trapped beneath panicked hooves. Not old barbers once needing pulled clear of gunfire. Which was, most likely, going to get her killed one of these days. Today looked a real strong candidate. She ducked through smoke thick enough to choke on, one arm thrown up, over her mouth, found the horse rearing hard against its tether, eyes rolled white, with panic, and got a hand on the lead rope just as a burning support beam groaned overhead. Easy. Her voice dropped low, steady, the voice she kept for exactly this kind of moment, calm laid over chaos like a blanket thrown across fire. Easy, girl. I've got you. Move. The horse bolted the second the rope came free, nearly dragging Trix off her feet, and together they burst back, through the smoke, into the open air just as the barn's main support gave way behind them, with a sound like the whole world tearing itself in half. The blast of heat that followed knocked Trix flat, onto dry grass, the horse screaming, and rearing free of her grip entirely, tearing off into the dark toward the creek. Behind her, the barn folded in on itself in a column of fire, and sparks that lit the whole field bright enough that, for one terrible second, she stood completely, perfectly visible to every armed man still standing at the edge of that light. There. A voice, close, closer than she'd have liked. She's right there. A shot cracked out. Dirt kicked up inches from her shoulder. Trix rolled, came up low, and found Agnes crouched behind an old fence post 20 feet off, face lit orange by the dying fire, eyes wide with a fear that had nothing performed about it at all. Move, Trix snapped, and they ran. They ran until the fire shrank to a dull orange smear behind them, swallowed whole by distance, and dark, the sounds of pursuit fading, into something Trix could no longer swear was real, or only her own heartbeat pounding loud enough to sound like footsteps. They stopped, at last, in a shallow ravine cut by some long dry creek bed, both of them gasping, both filthy with soot and dust and the particular exhaustion that comes after running on pure terror long past the point the body has anything left to give. Agnes slid down against the ravine wall, chest heaving. I'm getting far too old for this. You're not old. Trix crouched beside her, checking the shadows out of pure habit, though every part of her screamed to simply sit down and not rise again. You're just having an unreasonable week. A short, disbelieving laugh cracked out of Agnes despite it all. Is that meant to be a joke? Little bit. Terrible timing. I've been told. Trix finally allowed herself to sit back against cool earth and let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped in her chest since the moment the barn roof began coming down. We can't go back toward town. Not tonight. Maybe not for days yet. Then we go to the old Cutter place. Agnes was already thinking ahead, already rebuilding a plan, from the wreckage of the one that had just burned to the ground behind them. Abandoned homestead. Half a day's walk east. Nobody's lived there in 3 years. Trix nodded, too spent to argue, and for a moment they simply sat there in the dark, two women who'd both nearly died twice, over in a single night, listening to the creek bed's dry silence, and the far-off, fading crackle of a fire, that had wanted badly to end them both. Agnes. Trix's voice came quieter now. Rawr. That thing you wouldn't say earlier. About Nell's father. Agnes went still. Not tonight, she said. You keep saying that. Because it keeps being true. Agnes's voice cracked slightly, and in the dim starlight Trix could see her jaw working, fighting something down. You've had enough thrown at you today to break a person twice over. That part of the story, it can wait. It should wait. Trix wanted to push. Every instinct in her wanted to grab that thread and pull until the whole thing came unraveled right there in the dark. Except something in Agnes's face stopped her. Some old, weary grief that looked like it had been carrying its own weight a long while, patient, waiting for the right moment to finally set itself down. "Okay," Trix said instead. "Quiet." "Okay." They didn't speak again for a good while after that. Sat side by side in the dark, and let the night carry its own kind of silence around them, heavy and uneasy, full of things neither one of them was ready yet to say out loud. The Cutter place turned out to be less a homestead than a collection of collapsing intentions. A house with half a roof, a barn with none at all, and a well, Agnes swore, with more confidence than the evidence rightly deserved, still ran clean. It did, as it happened. Small mercies. They spent the better part of 2 days there, resting, tending Trix's shoulder properly this time, with clean bandages, and a poultice Agnes mixed, from herbs she'd had the presence of mind to grab on their way out of the burning barn, one small victory in a night that had otherwise gone entirely sideways. Trix used the quiet to think. Which was, in its own particular way, more dangerous than the fire had been. Because thinking meant circling back, over and over, to the one detail refusing to sit still in her mind. Ashby's voice out in the street. The particular calm of it. The way he hadn't once glanced at the 5 bleeding men in the dust, before turning the whole town's fear straight onto her. A lawman who found a street full of assault victims, and looked clean past every one of them to make certain the crowd was watching him instead. That wasn't instinct. That was rehearsal. Agnes. Trix sat across the small fire they'd built in the ruined hearth, watching flames throw shifting light across the older woman's tired face. The day of the robbery. What do you recall about how it started? Agnes's hands stilled, over the bandage roll she'd been winding. Same as everyone tells it. Gang rode in fast. Hit the bank, before anybody had time to raise an alarm. Except somebody did raise an alarm. Trix leaned forward, elbows on her knees. I remember that part clear as anything. Bell going off practically the second we were inside. Whole town coming out armed like they'd been waiting on us the entire time. You think somebody warned them? I think somebody let us in, and made certain the whole town stood ready the second we arrived. Trix's voice had gone hard, sharpened by years of turning that exact memory over without ever quite finding its shape. The back door of that bank was meant to be locked. Daniel checked it twice before we went in. It wasn't locked. Agnes had gone very quiet. Very still. Somebody opened that door, from the inside, Trix said. Somebody who knew exactly when we were coming and exactly how to make certain the whole town stood armed and waiting the moment we stepped through it. That's not bad luck, Agnes. That's a trap. Somebody built a trap and used us as bait to spring it, then let this whole town believe I was the one who'd set it. The fire popped and hissed between them. Agnes stared into it a long moment before speaking, and when she finally did, her voice had dropped low, careful, like she was picking her way across ice she wasn't certain would hold her weight. There's something in this house you ought to see. Trix's whole body went taut. What? When my husband passed, Agnes stood, moving toward a loose floorboard near the collapsed hearth, working her fingers into a gap Trix hadn't even marked. He did odd work for the bank, time to time. Repairs, mostly. Locks and hinges and the like. She pried the board free, revealing a small dark cavity beneath. Kept things he probably shouldn't have kept. Told me once, right before he died, that if anything ever happened to him sudden, I should look after this. Never told me why. Never understood it, not till tonight. She drew out a small metal box, rust-spotted, hinges stiff with disuse. Set it on the ground between them and pried the lid open with careful, trembling fingers. Inside lay a single brass key. Old. Ornate. The kind of key that belonged to something built to keep people out. And beneath it, folded soft with age, a scrap of paper covered in cramped, careful handwriting. Trix's hands shook as she lifted the paper into the firelight. Deputy W. Ashby requested duplicate vault key, claimed lock malfunction. Made copy per his instruction. Told me to keep quiet on it. Didn't like the way he asked. The date beneath sat a full 11 days ahead of the robbery. Trix stared at those words until the firelight blurred them, until her own pulse pounded loud enough to drown the crackle of the flames. He was only a deputy back then, Trix said, voice barely above a whisper. Not sheriff yet. Became sheriff 2 months after the robbery. Agnes's voice had gone hollow, words coming out like something long buried finally forcing its way clear to the surface. Town practically handed him the badge. Said he'd fought so bravely that day. Said no man alive deserved it more. A vault key. Trix's fingers curled tight around the paper. He had a copy made 11 days before we ever rode into that town. Before Daniel and I had even scouted the place. Before anyone outside our own gang so much as knew a job was coming. Which meant only one thing. A thing so ugly Trix could hardly make herself think it through to the end. Ashby hadn't stopped a robbery that day. He'd built one. From the inside. Used a gang of desperate outlaws, used her, used Daniel, as the perfect cover for whatever it was he'd truly been after. The gold, Trix said slowly, the pieces sliding together, with a horrible, clicking precision. The vault held more than what the papers ever reported stolen. I remember Daniel saying so, right before she stopped. Swallowed hard. Right before everything went to pieces. Agnes's face had gone the color of ash. Wendell Ashby didn't stop a robbery, Trix said, and saying it aloud made it real in a way merely thinking it never had. He staged one. Let us walk into a trap he'd built himself, took what he wanted, while the whole town busied itself hating outlaws, then wore the badge of the man who'd saved them for the rest of his natural life. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling what little remained of the old house's shutters, and somewhere in the dark beyond the firelight an owl called low and mournful into the night. All this time, Trix whispered. All this time I've been running from a crime I never committed. And the man who actually committed it has been sitting in the sheriff's chair the whole while. Wearing a star. Handing out justice to the very folk he'd stolen from. Agnes reached out and took her hand, the same steady grip she'd offered in the burning barn. There's more, Agnes said. Trix's stomach dropped. What more could there possibly be? Agnes's eyes filled, and this time she didn't look away from the question. This time she held Trix's gaze steady, even as her voice shook around the words that followed. It's about Daniel. The name sat heavy in that small burned-out room, and Trix felt every muscle in her body lock tight, bracing for something she somehow already knew, deep in the animal part of her chest, was going to break loose, something she'd spent years carefully holding together. Tell me, she said. Agnes drew a slow breath. The story everyone in town believes, the story you've most likely told yourself too, all this while is, that Daniel died in the crossfire. Caught a stray round in the chaos, same as half a dozen others that day. That's what happened. Trix's voice came out too fast, too certain, the reflexive defense of a wound she'd never once let anybody probe too close. I was there. I saw him fall. Did you see who fired? The question landed like a physical blow. Because the answer Trix had spent years refusing to examine too closely, burying it under grief and distance and the desperate, self-protective need simply to keep moving, was no. She hadn't seen who fired. She'd heard the shot. Turned. Found Daniel already falling, already gone, blood spreading fast across the back of his shirt. The back of his shirt. Trix's whole body went cold. He was shot in the back, she said slowly, the memory rising, with a clarity that felt like drowning. Never once thought about it. So much noise, so much happening all at once, I told myself it was a stray round. From the men firing at us, from the front of the bank. It wasn't. Agnes's voice had gone very quiet now, very careful, and Trix understood, with a kind of sick certainty, that whatever came next was the exact reason the old woman had spent a full night, and 2 days refusing to say it. My husband saw it happen, Agnes said. Told me the story only once, the night before he died, same night he gave me that box. Said he'd been hiding behind a supply wagon during the worst of it, close enough to see clear. Said Daniel had gotten separated from the rest of the gang in the chaos, was making his way toward the alley, where you and the baby had already gotten clear, and Ashby, her voice caught. Broke. Forced itself back together. Ashby came up behind him. Not from the bank. From behind. My husband said Daniel wasn't even facing the fight anymore. Was running toward you. And Ashby raised his rifle and shot him square, through the back, before he'd gone another 10 feet. The fire popped, sudden and loud in the silence, and Trix flinched like it had been a gunshot itself. Why, she managed at last, the word barely more than breath. Why would he? Because Daniel knew. Agnes's grip tightened around her hand, anchoring, desperate. My husband always believed that. Said Daniel must have pieced it together right there in those last chaotic minutes, exactly what Ashby had done. That the whole robbery had been staged. That the back door standing unlocked wasn't luck at all, it was a setup, and Daniel had understood it right there in the middle of the gunfire, and started running not only to get you and the baby clear, but because he'd finally understood who the real thief in that street was. Trix stared into the fire, and for one long, terrible moment the years fell away entirely, and she stood back in that street again, smoke and screaming, and her newborn daughter's cry cutting clean through the chaos, and Daniel's hand shoving her hard toward the alley. His face, she could see it now, could finally see it clear, after so long refusing to look, his face had been afraid. Not of the fight in front of him. Of something coming up behind. He wasn't only trying to save us, Trix whispered. He was trying to warn me. I believe so. And Ashby killed him for it. Her voice had gone flat now, stripped of everything, but a cold, clear fury that felt almost peaceful in its intensity, the eye of a storm she'd been circling a very long while without ever once finding its center. Shot him in the back. Let the whole town believe he died a criminal. Let me spend years running from a crime that man committed himself, while he wore a badge and collected whatever he'd stolen, and built himself a whole life on top of my husband's grave. Agnes said nothing further. There was nothing left worth saying that the fire between them hadn't already said better, crackling low and steady, throwing shifting orange light across two women who had both, in their own separate ways, spent a very long time carrying pieces of a truth neither of them had been strong enough to assemble alone. I have to go back, Trix said finally. Trix. Not tonight. She held up a hand, steadying herself, steadying the fury wanting badly to send her charging straight back, into Larkspur Hollow, with nothing but a revolver and a decade of rage. I know. Not tonight. But soon. I've a daughter in that town who doesn't know her mother's alive. I've a husband in the ground, who died trying to save us both. And I've a man wearing a badge, who built his whole life on top of both those facts. Her hand curled into a fist. That ends. However long it takes. Whatever it costs. That ends. Agnes reached over and closed the small metal box, brass key and folded paper safe inside once more, and held it out. Then you'll need this, she said. Proof doesn't win a gunfight. But it wins the fight that matters more. Trix took the box. Held it like it weighed more than metal and paper had any right to weigh. Get some sleep, Agnes said gently. Tomorrow's going to ask a great deal of both of us. Neither of them slept much. But they lay there regardless, side by side near the dying fire, and let the night pass around them the way nights always do. Slow, and dark, and full of things waiting on the far side of morning. Morning came gray, and overcast, clouds pressing low over the fields, the kind of light that made everything look a little unfinished. Trix woke before Agnes moved out to check the horse recovered overnight, grazing calm near what remained of a fence line, a small mercy in a stretch of days that had offered precious few of them. They needed supplies. That was the plain, unavoidable truth of it. 2 days of running and hiding had worn them both down thin, low on food, low on clean water, and Trix's shoulder, healing, but not healed, ached with every motion, reminding her constantly of exactly how close she'd come to not surviving the week at all. "There's a trading post," Agnes said, studying the horizon like it might offer a better option if she looked hard enough. "Small place. Half a day's ride, opposite direction from town. Man who runs it isn't the sort to ask questions, so long as you pay in coin and don't linger. And if word's already spread that far, then we'll find out quick." Agnes's mouth pressed into a thin line. Better to find out quick than to starve slow, wondering. They rode most of the day in near silence, the weight of everything they'd learned sitting heavy between them, neither one finding much appetite for conversation. Trix's mind kept circling back to the same worn groove in Nell's face, imagined and unreal, and Daniel's face, real and unbearable, both of them tangled together now, into something too large to carry, and impossible to set down. The trading post, when they reached it, sat at a crossroads that saw more dust than traffic, a low wooden building, with a sagging porch, and a hitching post worn smooth by decades of use. A handful of wagons stood parked outside. More activity than Trix would have preferred, but Agnes was right, they needed supplies too badly to be choosy about timing. They'd nearly finished loading their purchases, flour, dried meat, a few yards of clean cloth for bandages, when the first shout went up from somewhere down the crossroads. "Runaway team." Trix's head snapped up. A wagon had come loose from its break somewhere up the crossroads slope, the 2 horses pulling it spooked into a dead run by something, a snake, a gunshot, the particular unpredictable madness that sometimes just seizes animals for reasons no one ever quite untangles, and the wagon was barreling now straight down the main stretch, wheels shrieking, cargo bouncing loose, heading directly for a cluster of children playing near the well. Trix didn't think. Her body simply moved, the way it always moved in these moments, faster than conscious decision could ever catch up to. She was 3 strides into a dead run before she'd fully registered what she was doing, cutting an angle toward the well, toward the smallest of the children, a boy, couldn't have been more than 5, frozen solid in the particular terror that makes small children stand stock still in exactly the wrong moment instead of running clear. "Move," she screamed at the older children, and most of them scattered, but the small one stayed rooted, and the wagon was close now, close enough Trix felt the ground shaking under those pounding hooves. She hit the boy in a full tackle, rolling them both clear of the well's low stone wall a half-second before the runaway team thundered past, close enough she felt the wind of it against her back, close enough a stray hoof clipped her boot and sent a fresh jolt of pain through her already aching shoulder. The wagon careened past, missed the well by inches, and finally crashed sideways into a stack of empty crates further down the road, horses screaming, wood splintering, but the boy in her arms was breathing, was crying, was very much, gloriously, alive. Trix sat up slow, gathering the sobbing child against her chest, and looked up to find half the crossroads staring at her. Which was, she realized a half-second too late, exactly the problem. Because a soaking, blood-stained stranger who moved like that, who threw herself into a runaway wagon's path, without a single second of hesitation, was not a stranger, who stayed unremarkable for long. "Ma'am." An older woman rushed forward, gathering the crying boy out of Trix's arms, checking him over, with frantic hands. "Ma'am, thank you, I don't know how to." "He's fine," Trix said, already backing off, already scanning the gathered crowd for the particular look she'd learned to dread, recognition, dawning slow across a stranger's face. "Just fine. Get him home." But it was too late. A young man near the trading post's porch had gone very still, eyes narrowed, studying her with the particular intensity of somebody trying to match a face to a story he'd heard. "I know you," he said slowly. "You're the one from Larkspur Hollow. From the street." Time to go," Agnes said sharply, already at Trix's elbow, already pulling her toward the horses. They mounted fast, and Trix didn't look back as they rode hard away from the crossroads, but she didn't need to look back to know exactly what was unfolding behind her, whispers spreading fast through a gathered crowd, somebody already running for a horse, somebody already calculating what $2,000 might buy a poor trading post family. "That's going to be a problem," Trix said grimly, once the crossroads had shrunk to a smudge behind them. "Maybe." Agnes's face had gone tight with worry. "Or maybe it's worse than that." "What do you mean?" "That boy." Agnes's voice had dropped low. "I know his mother. Does washing, sometimes, for families in Larkspur Hollow. A beat. A terrible, sinking beat. Including mine. Including the house where Nell sleeps every night." Trix's stomach dropped straight through the saddle. Because it meant the trail she'd just left, however unintentional, however born of nothing but pure instinct and an inability to watch a child die in front of her, led, however indirectly, straight back toward the one secret she'd been most desperate to protect. "We need to move faster," Trix said, urgency cracking hard through every word. "If word gets back to town, before we do." "I know. If Ashby ever puts together that a witness saw the ghost saving a child, whose mother does laundry for your household." "I know, Trix." Agnes's voice had sharpened, with her own fear now, both women's terror finally matching pace with one another. "I know exactly what that means." They rode hard through the rest of the afternoon, pushing the horses harder than either animal rightly deserved, the sky darkening overhead, with clouds promising rain. Neither of them had time left to wait out. Trix's mind raced ahead of her body the whole way, turning over every possible outcome, every possible way this could still go wrong, and landing, at the end of every single one of them, on the same unbearable image. A little girl, with dark hair, and her mother's eyes, asleep in a house that might not be safe anymore. Because of her. Because some part of her simply couldn't watch a child die in the street, without moving, even when the moving cost more than she had left to spend. They reached the outskirts of Larkspur Hollow, as the last gray light drained out of the sky, and even from a distance, something felt wrong. Too many lanterns lit. Too much movement along the main street for an hour, that should have found most decent folk already at their supper. "Something's happened," Agnes breathed. They left the horses tied in a stand of trees a quarter-mile out, and approached on foot, keeping low, keeping to shadow the way years of practice had taught Trix to move, through hostile ground, without being seen. What they found, crouched behind a low stone wall at the edge of town, stopped Trix's heart cold. Ashby's men, a dozen strong now, spread along the main street, with torches and rifles, moving house to house in a slow, deliberate sweep. And at the center of it all, standing on the boardwalk outside the sheriff's office, with his hands clasped behind his back like a man surveying his own private kingdom, stood Wendell Ashby himself. "She's got help," Ashby was saying, voice carrying clear across the quiet street. "Somebody's been hiding her. Feeding her. Patching her wounds." His gaze swept slow across the gathered crowd of townsfolk, pulled from their homes to watch. "And I intend to find out exactly who." Trix's blood went to ice. Because 2 houses down the street, past the gathered crowd, past the torches and rifles, stood a small, tidy house with a lit window on the 2nd floor, and standing in that window, small, dark-haired, watching the commotion below, with wide, frightened eyes, was a little girl Trix had never once met, and would have known anywhere in this world. "Nell," she breathed. Agnes's hand clamped hard over her arm. "Don't. That's my daughter's house. That's my daughter's window. He's standing 2 houses off. Which is exactly why you cannot move." Agnes's whisper had gone fierce, desperate. "If he sees you now, tonight, with a dozen armed men standing between you and her. You don't save her. You get yourself killed in front of her window, and leave her an orphan a second time over. Trix's whole body strained forward, every instinct screaming to close the distance, to put herself bodily between her daughter and every armed man on that street. But Agnes was right, and the small, cold, rational part of Trix's mind, the part that had kept her alive years running, through exactly this kind of impossible arithmetic, knew it too. So she stayed, crouched behind a low stone wall in the deepening dark, watching a dozen armed men sweep closer and closer to the one house in Larkspur Hollow that mattered more to her than her own life, and forced herself, with everything she had left, not to move. Ashby's men reached Agnes's street, began knocking on doors, began asking questions in voices pitched loud enough to carry, loud enough to make certain every soul on that street understood exactly what would happen to anyone caught helping a wanted woman. And then, from further down the block, a shout went up. "Sheriff! Rider coming in from the crossroads says he's got word on the ghost." Ashby turned, sharp and immediate, crossing the street toward the breathless young rider who'd just galloped in, watching him lean down and speak low and urgent into the sheriff's ear, watched Ashby's face shift slowly, from irritation into something far more dangerous. Interest. "A boy," the rider was saying, loud enough now that fragments carried across the quiet street. "Runaway wagon, out at the crossroads trading post. She saved him. Whole crowd saw it. And word is," his voice dropped, but not quite low enough, "word is the boy's mother does washing for a house right here on this street." Ashby went very still. Very, very still. And then, slow, deliberate, he turned his head, and his gaze traveled the length of the street, past the crowd, past the torches, and settled, with a precision that turned Trix's stomach to stone, directly on the small, lit second-floor window, where a little girl still stood watching, wide-eyed, at the commotion unfolding below her. "Whitfield House," Ashby said, and his voice carried clear and cold across the whole street. "Search it. Now." Agnes made a sound beside Trix that was neither quite a sob nor quite a scream, some third thing born entirely of raw, animal terror, and Trix grabbed her arm hard enough to bruise, hauling her back down behind the wall, before the movement could catch anyone's eye. "We can't," Agnes whispered, shaking. "Trix, we can't just. We're not." Trix's voice had dropped into something low and lethal, every trace of hesitation burned clean out of it. "We're going to move. Now. Fast. Quiet. And when this is finished, Wendell Ashby is going to understand exactly what it costs a man to threaten a child in front of the woman who survived all this time just to make it back to her." Behind them, boots hit the Whitfield porch, hard and heavy, and a fist began pounding against the front door loud enough to rattle the windows. And somewhere above it all, through the small lit window on the second floor, Trix watched her daughter's small silhouette turn away from the glass, disappearing into the dark of the room behind it, and felt something inside her chest go permanently, irrevocably hard. Because there was no more running left in her. Not after tonight. Not after watching a dozen armed men descend on her daughter's home under the orders of the very man who'd shot her husband in the back, and built a kingdom on the lie of it. Whatever came next, however it arrived, Trix understood with a clarity sharper than any bullet she'd ever fired. This ended in Larkspur Hollow. One way. Or the other. The pounding on the Whitfield door didn't stop. It came again. Harder. A fist made of a man who'd never once in his life had to knock twice for anything he wanted. Inside the house, in the dark of the second-floor bedroom, a small girl stood frozen by the window, one hand pressed flat against the cold glass, watching torchlight flicker gold across the yard below. She didn't know the word for what she was feeling. Wouldn't have, at 8 years old, no matter how sharp a child she was. But her body knew it anyway, the same animal knowledge that made rabbits go still in tall grass, that made a heartbeat climb into a throat and stay there, refusing to come back down. Because something was wrong. She'd known it the moment the torches came up the street. Known it deeper still, when the sheriff's voice, a voice she'd heard plenty of times before, always smiling, always with a peppermint stick tucked in his coat pocket for the town's children, turned hard and cold and pointed itself, somehow, directly at her own front door. Downstairs, the door gave way. Trix heard it, from behind the stone wall a quarter mile off, not the sound itself, too far for that, but she felt it anyway, some invisible cord strung tight between her chest, and that small lit window snapping taut, with a violence that had nothing to do with distance. Now, she said, and she was already moving. Trix, Agnes's hand grabbed for her sleeve, missed. Trix, wait, we don't have a plan, we have a daughter in that house and a dozen armed men breaking down her door. Trix didn't slow. Didn't turn. That's the only plan there's time for. Except halfway across the field, some cold and stubborn piece of sense finally caught up with her and dragged her back down behind a low hedge at the edge of the yard, because charging in was exactly the kind of mistake that got children killed. Not adults. Children. The ones caught in the middle, when grown men, with rifles stopped thinking straight. So she watched instead. Made herself watch, every muscle screaming against the stillness, while Ashby's men swept through Agnes's small house room by room, torches throwing huge broken shadows across curtains, a vase shattering somewhere inside, a man's voice barking orders too muffled to catch. And then, a long, unbearable minute later, the front door opened again. A deputy stepped out, onto the porch, one hand wrapped tight around a small, thin wrist. Nell. Trix's whole body went to ice and fire at once, some terrible collision of relief and rage that had no proper name, because no feeling had ever asked her to hold both at once before. There she was. Alive. Small. Dark hair loose and wild around a face that even at this distance, even in torchlight, was unmistakably, achingly familiar, Daniel's jaw. Trix's own eyes. A stranger and the most known person in the entire world, standing on a porch in her nightgown, while a grown man's hand crushed too tight around her wrist. Let go of me. The girl's voice cracked out across the yard, sharp with a fury too big for her size. You're hurting me. Quiet down. The deputy didn't loosen his grip. Sheriff wants a word with you. I don't know anything. We'll see about that. Beside Trix, Agnes had gone rigid, a low, broken sound caught somewhere in her throat, and Trix grabbed her hand hard, pressing until the older woman's breathing steadied, because falling apart now bought neither of them a single second of anything useful. They're taking her to Ashby, Agnes whispered. Trix. They're taking her to Ashby. I know. What do we? We follow. Trix's voice had dropped into something Agnes had never once heard from her before. Flat. Certain. The voice of a woman who had run clean out of every option except the last one. And when the moment comes, we take it. They kept low, kept to shadow, trailing 100 yards back, as the deputy marched Nell down the center of Larkspur Hollow's main street toward the sheriff's office, torchlight throwing the whole procession into something that looked, from a distance, almost ceremonial. A town holding its breath. Curtains twitching in every window. Nobody daring to step outside, because everyone in Larkspur Hollow had learned, over the years, exactly what happened to people who stood too close to Wendell Ashby's business. Ashby was waiting on the boardwalk outside his office, arms crossed, a cold, patient smile already fixed in place like he'd known this exact moment was coming, since the second he'd heard about a runaway wagon at a crossroads trading post. Well now. He crouched slightly, bringing himself level with the girl's furious, frightened face. You must be Agnes Whitfield's little niece. I'm not her niece. Nell's chin came up, defiant even now, even here. And I don't have to talk to you. Something flickered across Ashby's face. Interest, maybe. Or recognition. Trix, watching from the shadows between two buildings, felt her stomach drop straight through the boardwalk, because she could see it too, the same thing Ashby was clearly seeing. Her own eyes set into a face that hadn't yet learned how to hide anything at all. "What's your name, girl?" "Nell." "Just Nell." The girl hesitated. And in that hesitation lived a whole small history Trix had no way of knowing yet, no way of understanding, until later, because Agnes had raised her under Whitfield, careful and quiet, exactly the way a woman protecting a secret ought to. Nell had grown up answering to that name in the schoolhouse, at church, at the general store, all of it clean and unremarkable for years on end. Except this past winter, a boy at school had teased her cruel about having no real family of her own, no true name, only a borrowed one, from a spinster aunt nobody had ever once heard tell of, before she showed up, with a baby in her arms. And something in Nell, stubborn, proud, too young yet to understand the danger buried inside it, had gone looking through Agnes's old letterbox one rainy afternoon, while the older woman was out doctoring a neighbor's sick calf. Found a single yellowed page, half burned at one corner, mentioning a name. Calder. Found nothing else. No explanation. No context. Only that one word, and a child's fierce, lonely need to believe it meant something. She'd never told Agnes what she'd found. Had only started, quiet and private, calling herself Calder inside her own head whenever the other children were unkind. A secret name for a secret hurt. She hadn't understood, not truly, what door she was about to kick wide open. Nell Calder. The girl spat it out like a challenge, too young yet to understand what that name meant to the man standing over her, too proud in this one unbearable moment to let a stranger's grip on her wrist make her small. Ashby went very still. And Trix, watching from the dark, understood in that single frozen second exactly how badly this had just gone wrong. Calder, Ashby repeated, slow, savoring it. He straightened up, and the smile crossing his face now had nothing warm left in it at all. Well, isn't that interesting? He looked up. Scanned the shadows along the street, with the particular unhurried confidence of a man who already believed he'd find what he wanted there, sooner or later, one way or another. Bring her inside, he said. Somebody's about to come collect her. And when they do, his gaze swept the darkness one more time, and for one terrible instant, Trix could have sworn it landed directly on the gap between the buildings, where she stood. I intend to be ready. They didn't sleep that night. Couldn't have, even if exhaustion hadn't already worn both of them down to raw nerve and aching bone. Agnes paced the small hollow, where they'd taken shelter, a half-collapsed grain shed a mile outside town, wringing her hands raw. He'll hurt her. He'll use her to draw you out, and the second you show yourself, I know what he'll do. Trix sat very still against the shed wall, the small metal box, with the brass key, and Agnes's husband's letter resting heavy in her lap, turning it over, and over like the answer might be hidden somewhere in the rust. I've known what a man like that will do, since the day he shot my husband in the back, and let a whole town call him a hero for it. Then what's the plan? There isn't one. Trix's voice came out low. Steady. Terrifyingly calm. There's just tomorrow. And what I'm willing to give up to get her back. Agnes stopped pacing. Studied her a long moment in the thin moonlight leaking through the shed's broken slats. You're not talking about a fight, she said slowly. You're talking about a surrender. I'm talking about whatever gets my daughter out of that man's hands. Trix's jaw tightened. If that means walking into the middle of Larkspur Hollow with my hands raised and a target on my chest, then that's exactly what it means. I've spent years running to keep myself alive. I'm done spending Nell's safety on that particular currency. He won't just let you walk in and take her. No. A grim, humorless almost smile ghosted across Trix's mouth. But he will want the whole town watching when he finally gets to hang the ghost in the street. Man like that doesn't want a quiet ending. He wants a story. She closed her hands slowly around the metal box. And stories have a funny way of getting away from the man who thinks he's writing them. Dawn came gray and heavy, clouds pressing low over Larkspur Hollow like the sky itself had decided to hold its breath along with the town beneath it. Word had already spread by the time Trix rode in from the East Road, alone, unarmed but for the revolver she wore openly at her hip, because a woman walking into her own execution empty-handed would only look like a trick, and she needed, more than anything today, to look exactly like what she was. A mother. Coming for her child. The street was lined 3 deep with townsfolk by the time she reached the center of Larkspur Hollow. Word of a hanging, a real one, the ghost herself, finally caught, had done in one night what years of rumor never quite managed. Every soul in the county, it seemed, had found a reason to be standing on that boardwalk this particular morning. Ashby stood waiting beside the old gallows in front of the bank, the very same gallows, Trix realized with a cold jolt, that had stood in that same spot the day Daniel died 50 feet from where she now sat her horse. Ashby's Winchester rested easy across his forearm, and behind him, more than a dozen of his men fanned out along both sides of the street, rifles half raised, faces set grim and ready. And beside him, one small hand caught tight in his gloved fist, stood Nell. Trix's whole world narrowed down to that single image. Her daughter. Small and defiant, and terrified all at once, chin still raised even now, even here, in a way that broke something loose and raw in Trix's chest. She dismounted slow. Deliberate. Every eye on that street fixed on her. Hello. Ashby's voice carried easy across the quiet, that same practiced calm he'd worn in the street days before, when 5 men lay bleeding at her feet, and he'd looked past every one of them straight at her. Knew you'd come back for her. Mothers always do. Sentimental thing, motherhood. Predictable. Let her go. Trix's voice came out flat. Even. Nothing in it for him to read, nothing in it for him to use. You have what you wanted. Me. Standing right here. I have what I wanted a long time, before you ever rode into town, Miss Calder. Ashby's smile thinned. You've only made it easier to collect. Trix's gaze flicked, one heartbeat, to Nell's face, and found, buried under the fear, something else. Something sharp. Something that looked, impossibly, like her daughter was already calculating, already looking for an angle, the same stubborn refusal to simply stand still and be afraid, that Trix recognized, because she'd carried it herself every single day for years now. Not yet, baby. Not yet. How many more people have to die, Trix said, loud enough now to carry across the whole silent street, loud enough for every window, and every hiding townsperson to hear, just to keep your secret buried, Wendell. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Ashby's face tightened. Careful, he said. You had a key made to that vault 11 days before the robbery. Trix took one slow step forward, hands loose at her sides, empty, deliberate. 11 days, Wendell. Before anyone outside my own gang even knew a job was coming. You opened that back door yourself. Let us walk straight into a trap you'd built. And when my husband figured it out, when he understood, right there in the middle of the gunfire, exactly what you'd done, you shot him in the back, and let this whole town bury him, as a criminal. The murmur sharpened, into something with an edge on it now, spreading fast through the gathered crowd. Lies. Ashby's voice cracked, just slightly, just enough. Desperate lies from a desperate woman. Then let her go. Trix's own voice had dropped low now, dangerous and quiet in a way that carried further than shouting ever could. If it's lies, you've nothing to fear from a story nobody believes. Let my daughter go, and I'll stand right here and let this whole town watch you prove me wrong. Ashby's grip on Nell's wrist tightened. The girl winced, bit down hard on the sound that wanted to escape her, and Trix watched her own hands curl into fists at her sides, every instinct in her body screaming to close the distance right now, consequences be damned. You don't get to make demands, Ashby snapped, and for the first time something in his composure cracked visible, a thin fracture line running through years of careful performance. You're a wanted criminal standing in the middle of my street. You'll drop that gun. Right now. Or I put a bullet through this girl before you can blink. The street went dead silent. Trix's whole body had gone cold, the kind of cold that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the particular, unbearable arithmetic of a mother staring down the barrel pointed at her child. Think. There has to be. Except there wasn't. Not this time. Not with a dozen rifles behind him, and her daughter's wrist crushed in his fist, and every advantage stacked so far onto his side of the scale that the only move left, the only one, was the one she'd known was coming since the moment she'd ridden into town that morning. Slow. Deliberate. Trix reached down and drew her revolver from its holster. A gasp ran through the crowd. She held it a moment, weight familiar in her palm the way it had been familiar through every hard year of survival, and then she lowered herself, slow, down onto one knee in the dust of the street. And set the gun down. The metal struck the packed dirt with a sound that seemed, in that silence, louder than any gunshot that had ever echoed down that particular street. There, Trix said, voice steady even as something in her chest tore itself apart. It's done. I'm unarmed. I'm on my knees. Whatever you want to happen next, Wendell, it happens to me now. Not her. Me. Because that was the truth she'd carried her whole life, long before Larkspur Hollow, long before the badge on Ashby's chest, or the vault key in his pocket, or any of it. Never point a gun at someone weaker than you, unless there's no other road left. And there was no gun in the world worth more to her, in this moment, than the one thing she'd just proven, with empty hands in the dust. The crowd had gone utterly silent, and something in that silence had shifted, subtle but unmistakable, a current running through the gathered townsfolk that hadn't been there 30 seconds before. Because they'd all come expecting a hanging. A monster brought low. And what they were watching instead was a woman lay down the only thing standing between her and a rope, for the sake of a child who wasn't even fighting back against her captor anymore, who had simply gone still, watching her mother kneel in the dust, with an expression far too old for an 8-year-old's face. Even Ashby seemed thrown, just for a moment, his rifle wavering slightly, as the crowd's mood shifted beneath him like ground before a slide. Don't look at her like that, he barked at the crowd, voice cracking with something that hadn't been there before, panic, thin and rising. She's putting on a show. That's all this is. A show. Nobody answered him. Just the wind, and the creak of the gallows sign overhead. And that was the exact moment Nell moved. It happened fast. Faster than anyone standing on that street had time to properly track. Nell, small, sharp, furious, a girl who'd spent years being told to sit quiet and mind her manners, and had apparently decided, in this single unbearable moment, that quiet had run entirely out of road, twisted her captured wrist hard against the grip Ashby's distraction had loosened, and drove her heel down, full force, onto the top of his boot. Ashby howled. His grip broke. And in the half-second that followed, the exact half-second Trix's whole body had been coiled and waiting for, without even knowing it, Nell dove sideways, clear of the line between Ashby's rifle and her mother's kneeling form, and Trix moved. Because years of survival didn't live in the mind. They lived in the body, faster than thought, faster than fear, and Trix's hand closed around the revolver in the dust, and came up in one single fluid motion even, as Ashby's rifle swung wild, off balance, trying too late to find a target, that had just stopped being a helpless kneeling woman, and become, instead, exactly what the whole territory had always called her. The shot cracked out across Larkspur Hollow. Ashby's rifle spun from his hands, clattering into the dust a dozen feet away, and he staggered back, clutching a hand that had, an instant before, been wrapped around a trigger aimed at an 8-year-old girl. He could have died in that half-second. Trix's aim had been true enough for that, easy enough for that, after everything. But something in her, the same something, that had aimed for shoulders instead of hearts outside the silver-crowned saloon days before, had chosen, even now, even after everything Ashby had taken from her, to leave him breathing. Because dead men couldn't confess. And Trix hadn't ridden into Larkspur Hollow this morning for revenge. She'd ridden in for the truth. Ashby went down hard, onto his knees in the dust, cradling his shattered hand, and for one long, suspended moment the entire street simply stared at the sheriff bleeding in the street he'd ruled, through fear for years, at the wanted woman standing over him with a smoking gun she hadn't fired to kill, at the small dark-haired girl scrambling free, and racing, without a single second of hesitation, straight into her mother's arms. Trix caught her. Dropped the revolver entirely this time, both arms closing tight around a daughter she'd carried for exactly 3 weeks, nearly a decade past, and had spent every single day, since believing she'd never hold again. Mama. The word came out of Nell in a broken, disbelieving whisper, like she was testing whether saying it out loud might make the whole moment disappear. Agnes said, she said you might be. I didn't believe her. I didn't want to believe her, because I didn't want it to not be true. I'm here. Trix's voice cracked wide open, years of careful, guarded control shattering apart in the space of a single held breath. I'm here, baby. I'm not going anywhere. Not ever again. Around them, the crowd had gone utterly, completely silent, watching a scene none of them had come to that street expecting to witness. And into that silence, a new voice broke through, cracked and strained, but carrying with a force that made every head on that street turn at once. Let me through. Elias Crane pushed his way to the front of the crowd, moving slow, one arm cradled awkward against his side, his face bruised dark along one cheekbone in a way it hadn't been a handful of days before. He stopped a dozen feet from where Ashby knelt bleeding in the dust, and the old barber's eyes, when they found the fallen sheriff's face, held something that had finally, after years and years, stopped being afraid. You did this. Elias's voice shook, but it didn't stop. To my own face. Sent men to my shop, after dark, told me if I ever spoke a word about that day, about what I really saw. His hand rose, trembling, to the bruise along his cheek. Told me next time they wouldn't stop at only a warning. The crowd's murmur had turned to something harder now. Sharper. A current building toward a break. He's lying, Ashby ground out, still on his knees, cradling his ruined hand. Old fool's lying, same as she is. I'm not lying. Elias's voice rose, cracked, but held. I've carried the truth of that day for years, because I was too scared to say it out loud. Scared of you, Wendell Ashby. Scared of what wearing that badge let you do to anybody who ever crossed you. He drew a shaking breath. I'm done being scared. He turned, slow, to face the gathered crowd, his neighbors, his customers, folk he'd cut the hair of for 30 years, and said, loud and clear, the words he'd swallowed down all that time. I saw him. The day of the robbery. I saw Wendell Ashby standing at the bank's back door, before the gang ever rode in. Saw him check it stood unlocked. Thought nothing of it at the time. He was a deputy, after all. Why would a deputy be doing anything but his duty? His voice broke, steadied. It wasn't till years later, turning it over and over in my mind the way an old man does, with things that never quite sat right, that I understood what I'd actually seen. He wasn't checking that door was secure. He was making certain it wasn't. He paused. And when he spoke again, something in his voice had gone raw in a different way entirely, something older and deeper than fear. There's more, he said. Something I never told a living soul. Not my wife. Not the church. Nobody. His gaze moved, slow and pained, toward the ground somewhere near Ashby's boots. My boy died that day. You all remember that. Everybody in this town remembers burying Samuel Crane alongside the men killed by the gang, and everybody in this town has always believed the same story I believed for years, that a stray round from the outlaws took him. His voice cracked entirely now, and he let it. Except I was standing not 30 feet off when it happened. And the shot that killed my son didn't come from the direction of the bank at all. It came from behind us. From the same direction, the very same angle. My mind's turned over 1,000 times since learning what I just heard about a vault key made 11 days early. His eyes lifted, finally, and found Ashby's face directly. I told myself for years it couldn't be what it looked like. Told myself a grieving father's eyes play tricks. But I know now I wasn't wrong. My boy didn't die from outlaw fire, Wendell. He died because he was standing too close to whatever it was you were covering up that afternoon, and you never once cared who else went down around you, so long as your own tracks stayed buried. The silence that followed had a different weight to it than anything that had come before. Even the wind seemed to still. Ashby lunged up off his knees, one good hand grasping for something, a weapon, an escape, anything, and two men from the crowd stepped forward, without a word between them, and hauled him back down, rough, final. "There's proof," Trix said, rising, one arm still wrapped tight around Nell's shoulders, the other reaching into her coat for the small metal box she'd carried the whole ride into town. "Not just memory. Proof." She opened the box. Drew out the brass key. Drew out the folded, careful handwriting of a dead locksmith who'd kept a secret for years out of nothing but fear, until his widow decided fear had cost this town enough. "A vault key," Trix said, voice carrying clear and hard across the silent street, "made to Wendell Ashby's order 11 days before the robbery. Before anyone outside my own gang knew a job was even coming. He didn't stop a robbery. He built one." She let that sentence land, let it settle over the crowd the same way Ashby's own lies had settled there years before, except this time it was true, and truth, once it finally arrived, carried a weight nothing else could match. "He used my husband, and me and every man who rode with us, as cover for whatever he wanted out of that vault. When Daniel figured it out, when he understood, right there in the gunfire, exactly what Ashby had done, Ashby shot him in the back, and let this whole town bury him, as the villain in his own story." A woman in the crowd made a sound like something breaking. An old man removed his hat, slow, and pressed it against his chest. "You built a life on my husband's grave," Trix said, and her voice had gone very quiet now, quiet enough the whole street leaned in to catch it. "Wore his death like a badge of honor for years. Hunted me across half this territory to make certain nobody ever asked the questions that might unravel it. Killed a boy who never once had anything to do with any of it, and let his father carry that grief alone, believing it was somebody else's bullet." Her eyes flicked once to the small girl still gripped tight against her side. "And you did all of it while my daughter grew up 2 streets over from the man who murdered her father, calling him sheriff. Trusting him. Taking peppermint sticks from the very hand that pulled the trigger." The crowd's fury, when it finally broke all at once, the same way the dam had broken days before in this very street, except this time the anger wasn't aimed at her. "Get him up." The blacksmith's voice thundered out over the gathered crowd, and he stepped forward, with an old hunting rifle held loose, but ready in both hands. Behind him, 2 more men moved, a shopkeeper, a wagon driver, men Trix had never met, but who apparently, after years of quiet fear, had finally run clean out of patience for a thing they'd never fully understood the shape of. "We've had enough of you standing over this town like you own it. You can't." Ashby's voice had lost every trace of its practiced calm now, cracking wide open into something desperate and small. "I'm the law here. You were never the law." Elias's voice cut through, steady now in a way it hadn't been in years. "You were only ever the loudest liar in a town too frightened to check your story." 2 men stepped forward and tore the silver star from Ashby's coat, and the sound of that small metal pin coming free seemed to echo across the whole street, final and absolute, the last thread of a lie years in the weaving finally, completely undone. They took Ashby to the jail he'd run for the better part of a decade, and this time it was other hands that turned the key. The street slowly began to breathe again, the particular collective exhale of a town waking from a nightmare it hadn't fully understood it was living inside. Women wept openly. Men who'd stood silent through years of fear found themselves, one by one, stepping forward to say some version of the same thing. I always wondered. I never let myself ask. I'm sorry. Trix barely heard any of it. Her whole world, in that moment, had narrowed down to the small, warm weight of her daughter pressed against her side, and the particular, disorienting joy of finally, after all this time, being allowed to simply exist in the same space as the child she'd spent every single day believing was lost to her. You're really my mother. Nell tipped her face up, studying Trix with an intensity that felt, for one strange, aching second, exactly like looking into a mirror set years back in time. Agnes always said maybe. Never for certain. Said certain things were dangerous to be certain about. She was protecting you. Trix knelt down, bringing herself level with her daughter's face the same way. She realized with a small, painful jolt that Ashby had knelt to speak with her the day before, except everything about the gesture felt different now, felt like something worth reclaiming for good. The same way I thought I was protecting you all those years back, when I handed you to a stranger in the dark, because I believed it was the only way to keep you safe from everything my name had become. You were wrong. Nell's chin came up, stubborn, the same stubbornness Trix recognized from every mirror she'd avoided for years. You should have kept me. I know that now. Trix's voice cracked, and she didn't fight it this time, didn't push the feeling back down the way survival had trained her to. I know that now, and I am never, ever making that mistake again. Agnes had made her way through the thinning crowd, tears still streaking her weathered face, and Nell turned, reaching for the older woman's hand, without letting go of her mother's at the same time. One small girl anchored suddenly, impossibly, to both the past that had raised her and the future that had finally found her. Thank you. Trix's voice, when she found it, came out rough. For all these years of keeping her safe. For not being able to hand her off to strangers, no matter how much sense it made at the time. For everything. She's the best thing that ever walked into my quiet little life. Agnes wiped her eyes, laughing wet and unsteady. I should be thanking you. For trusting me with her. Even if you didn't know you were doing it. The days that followed moved slower than any Trix had known in years of constant motion. Ashby's trial, when it came, was short. The vault key, the locksmith's letter, Elias's testimony, and, most damning of all, a full ledger recovered from beneath the floorboards of the sheriff's own office, meticulously documenting years of stolen gold laundered slow and careful through a dozen small dealings across the territory. The math of it, once townsfolk finally sat down and did it properly, accounted for exactly the kind of wealth a man drawing a modest sheriff's salary had no honest business possessing. He was sentenced to hang from the very same gallows he'd built to threaten a street full of frightened people days before. Trix didn't attend. Didn't need to. Some kinds of justice, she decided, didn't require her presence to be complete. They only required, at long last, to actually happen. What she did attend, instead, on a warm afternoon 2 weeks later, was a small gathering at the edge of Larkspur Hollow, where the townsfolk, the same people who had once gathered eagerly to watch her hang, came together instead to help raise a new roof on a small, tidy house at the edge of town. Her house, as it turned out. Because somewhere in the whirlwind of testimony and reckoning and slow, careful town meetings, the people of Larkspur Hollow had decided, collectively and without much need for discussion, that a debt owed years overdue deserved to finally be settled. Trix stood in the yard that afternoon, watching men she'd never properly met hammer new boards into a roof that would, come winter, keep her daughter warm and dry, and felt something in her chest settle for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember. Not peace, exactly. Peace felt like too large a word, yet for something this new, this fragile. But something close to it. Something that might, given enough time, grow into it. You could still leave, you know. Agnes settled onto the porch step beside her, watching Nell chase a pair of squawking chickens across the yard, with the same reckless joy every 8-year-old in history had probably chased chickens with, unburdened, for one bright afternoon, by anything larger than the simple thrill of the chase. Nobody would blame you. All that running doesn't just stop the moment the man chasing you finally gets caught. I thought about it. Trix's eyes stayed on her daughter, watching the sun catch dark hair the exact shade of her own. Thought about it the whole ride in, if I'm honest. Some old habit that just doesn't know yet how to let go. And I looked at that girl kneeling in the dust, willing to bite a grown man's hand to save her own mother, Trix said, quiet, and I understood that I'd already spent years running from a place that never should have made me run in the first place. I'm done paying rent on somebody else's lie. Agnes smiled, slow and warm, and reached over to take Trix's hand the same steady way she had in a burning barn weeks before. Welcome home, then, she said. Trix looked out over the yard, the half-finished roof, the chickens, the men laughing easy as they worked, her daughter's bright, unguarded laughter carrying clear across the warm afternoon air, and let herself, finally, after everything, believe it. Because that was the truth nobody had ever managed to teach her out on the long road, town after town, grave after grave. That surviving and living had never once been the same thing. That a woman could run far enough and fast enough to keep her body breathing and still lose, somewhere along all those miles, the only thing that had ever made the breathing worth the trouble. She'd found it again. Small and stubborn and chasing chickens across a sunlit yard. And this time, she wasn't running anywhere at all.